Welcome back to another episode of Background Historian. Tonight we will be taking a dive into the Spanish Inquisition. This was a long enduring chapter in history, which will require us to take a look into its beginnings, causes, and both intentional and unintentional results. Like always, lay down, relax, and let my voice soothe you to sleep. Let's begin. To question is to challenge, and to challenge is to threaten. In the eyes of the powerful, doubt was not an opportunity, it was a danger. And so, in the heart of Spain, a tribunal was born, not from mercy, but from fear. Let us begin our story not with torches and dungeons, but with a question. What makes a state fear its own people? What leads a nation, rich in heritage, devout in faith, to turn inward and seek out enemies among its neighbors, its friends, its own kin? The Spanish Inquisition, or La Inquisición Española, did not emerge from a vacuum. It was not the madness of a single man, nor merely the whim of kings. It was a convergence, a storm gathering over centuries of political tension, religious zeal, social anxiety, and imperial ambition. The precedent, Inquisitions before Spain. The concept of Inquisition, meaning to inquire, to investigate, was not uniquely Spanish. The first Inquisitions began under the authority of the Catholic Church in the 12th century, aimed at rooting out heresy in southern France, particularly among the Cathars. These early Inquisitions were managed by papal legates and Dominican friars who were granted unusual powers to question, detain, and punish those suspected of harboring unorthodox beliefs. In essence, it was a spiritual police force, cloaked in ecclesiastical robes, enforcing uniformity in belief. Heresy, they believed, was not merely a personal error, it was a disease that could infect communities and tear apart Christendom. 2. Spain in the 15th century, a kingdom at a crossroads. By the late 1400s, Spain was not yet the unified nation we imagine today. It was a collection of kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and others, each with their own traditions, languages, and power structures. But a monumental union had just occurred. Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon had married, forming what would become the cornerstone of modern Spain. Together, they were known as the Catholic monarchs. And their shared vision was one of unity, not only political, but religious. Their motto was simple: Una fe, una ley, un rey, one faith, one law, one king. But Spain was not one faith. It was a mosaic. Jews had lived in Iberia for centuries, building communities, rising to prominence in fields like medicine, finance, and administration. Muslims, too, were part of this tapestry, descendants of the great Islamic caliphates that had once ruled much of the peninsula. And now, as the Christian kingdoms slowly reconquered territory from Muslim rule, a centuries-long process known as the Reconquista, they were inheriting not only land, but people. People who worshipped differently, who dressed differently, who prayed in other tongues. The Catholic monarchs faced a question: could such a diverse empire truly be one? 3. The Conversos, conversion and suspicion. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west into legend, the Spanish crown issued the Alhambra decree: all Jews in Spain must convert to Christianity, or leave. Tens of thousands fled. But tens of thousands more converted. These new Christians, known as conversos, often did so under immense pressure. And though many embraced their new faith sincerely, others continued Jewish practices in secret, hiding behind closed shutters and muffled candles. And here lies the spark. It was not the Jews who became the primary targets of the Spanish Inquisition, it was the conversos. Not the Muslims, but the former Jews who were now Christians. Why? Because the church feared them most. These were people who outwardly professed Christian belief but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. They were considered insidious, hard to detect, and above all, dangerous, wolves in sheep's clothing. This fear gave birth to a terrible machine. 4. The Establishment, 1478 and the Papal Bull. In 1478, Ferdinand and Isabella petitioned Pope Sixtus IV to grant them the authority to establish a new Inquisition in their kingdoms, one that was not controlled by Rome, but by the crown. The Pope hesitated. Such power, given to secular monarchs, was dangerous. But pressure prevailed. In a papal bull, the Spanish monarchs were granted the authority to appoint inquisitors to investigate conversos suspected of heresy. The Spanish Inquisition had begun. Unlike earlier Inquisitions, this one was uniquely state-run. It was not just a religious project, it was political. It gave the monarchs a tool to unify the realm under Catholicism, but also to control dissent, seize wealth, and silence opposition. The tribunal, structure, power, and fear. The tribunal moved swiftly and mercilessly. It created a network of inquisitors, informants, notaries, and secret prisons. It operated in secrecy, often giving the accused no chance to confront their accusers or understand the charges against them. Torture was sanctioned to extract confessions. Property was seized. Public autos de fe, acts of faith, were held in grand public squares, where sentences were read aloud and heretics were burned, sometimes in silence, sometimes to the jeering of crowds. And yet, the Inquisition also operated with a strange legalism. It maintained records. It followed procedures. Inquisitors often believed they were saving souls. That the fire purified. That confession was liberation. It is a paradox. A horror wrapped in ritual. 6. The impacts, fear as control. The Spanish Inquisition did not limit itself to former Jews. Over time, it expanded its net. Muslims who converted became targets. Then Protestants. Then mystics. Then books. Even Catholic priests, monks, and nuns were not safe if they espoused ideas considered unorthodox. By the 16th century, the Inquisition had become a symbol of royal power, used not just to root out heresy, but to control thought. It became an arm of censorship, banning works of art, science, and literature that conflicted with doctrine. The chill of fear spread across Spain. People whispered in code. Neighbors became informants. Children were taught to denounce their parents if they saw signs of forbidden rituals. And so, a kingdom that had once been a beacon of intellectual diversity, of Jewish scholars, Islamic architects, and Christian theologians, was reduced to a monoculture of silence. By candlelight and parchment, the Inquisition recorded everything but revealed nothing. Behind every accusation was a silence, behind every confession, a scream. This was not only a court of faith. It was a theater of control. As Spain entered its golden age, an empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines, its Inquisition grew alongside it. What had begun as a tribunal to judge the faith of former Jews became a sprawling apparatus of surveillance, censorship, and punishment, tied intimately to Spain's sense of divine mission and imperial destiny. The reach of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition extended far beyond Spain's borders. As the Spanish Empire expanded, so too did its fear of unorthodoxy. In Mexico, in Peru, in the Caribbean, Spanish authorities established colonial tribunals to oversee the spiritual purity of new converts, especially among indigenous peoples and African slaves. These communities were often accused of blending Catholicism with their traditional beliefs, an act the Church called syncretism, and the Inquisition labeled heresy. Missionaries taught conversion with crucifix and catechism, while inquisitors ensured it stuck with fear and fire. But it wasn't only the colonized who were watched. Spaniards in the colonies, administrators, settlers, soldiers, were subject to scrutiny too. A blasphemous remark. A suspicious absence from Massachusetts. A book tucked into luggage from France. These could trigger investigations, interrogations, even imprisonment. 2. The anatomy of a trial. Let us pause here and walk into the inner chambers of an Inquisition tribunal. Imagine, a man is arrested, often at night, with no warning. He is not told why. He is brought to a secret cell. He waits days, weeks, sometimes months. The fear is constant. The uncertainty, worse. Eventually, he is called. He meets the inquisitors, stern men in black robes, educated, fluent in both scripture and law. They ask questions, calmly, even kindly. They offer a chance to confess. But confess to what? The accused doesn't know what he's being accused of. He is told he has enemies. That witnesses have spoken. But their names will not be shared. Their statements, redacted. He is told to search his soul. If he does not confess, he is taken to the Torquemada, the chamber of torture. The rack. The strappado. Sleep deprivation. Burning coals. The inquisitors rarely deliver the pain themselves, they simply record it, solemnly, as procedure. The goal is not punishment. It is purification. A soul made clean through agony. Eventually, there is the auto de fe. A public ceremony of sentencing. Sometimes the accused is pardoned, made to wear a penitent's robe and paraded through the streets. Sometimes they are exiled. Sometimes imprisoned for life. And sometimes they are handed to the secular authorities for execution. The church would not kill, they said. But they would suggest the fire. 3. Tomás de Torquemada, the face of fanaticism. Among the early figures of the Inquisition, one name towers above the rest, Tomás de Torquemada. Appointed the first Grand Inquisitor in 1483, Torquemada became the architect of terror. A Dominican friar, he was utterly devoted to the unity of the faith, and utterly ruthless in his methods. He believed the soul of Spain depended on eliminating false converts. Under his watch, thousands were investigated. Hundreds were burned. And though his defenders claim he was a man of logic and process, history remembers him for his severity. He was both respected and feared, by kings, clergy, and commoners alike. Torquemada's legacy is complicated. He helped centralize power under the crown. He brought uniformity to what had been chaotic religious practices. But at what cost? Underneath his robes was not a villain in the cartoonish sense, but something perhaps more disturbing, a bureaucrat of the divine. A man who believed that cruelty was not only justified, but sacred. 4. Famous cases and censorship. Some of the Inquisition's most famous trials reveal the breadth of its reach. Luis de Carvajal the Younger, a converso in New Spain, Mexico, was arrested in 1596 for secretly practicing Judaism. His entire family was caught in the net. His confessions were written in his own blood, before he was burned at the stake. Fray Luis de Leon, a brilliant Spanish theologian and poet, was imprisoned for translating the Song of Songs into Spanish, a crime because the Bible was not to be read in the vernacular. He emerged years later, quietly returned to his post at the University of Salamanca, and opened his first lecture with the calm words, "As we were saying yesterday." Even the great Miguel de Cervantes, author of Don Quixote, tread carefully. His satirical writings poked at religious hypocrisy, but he never directly criticized the Inquisition. He knew the price. The Inquisition was not just a force of blood and iron, it was also one of silence. Books were burned. Libraries censored. The index of forbidden books grew longer each year. Galileo's heliocentric theories. Erasmus's humanism. Even mystical Christian writings that emphasized personal spiritual experience were suppressed. And so, the Inquisition didn't just burn bodies, it buried ideas. The Inquisition and women. Though less frequently discussed, women were not spared. Many women, particularly widows, healers, or those seen as too independent, found themselves accused of heresy or witchcraft. Some were midwives or herbalists. Others were simply poor and powerless. The Inquisition in Spain was not as aggressively focused on witchcraft as the tribunals in Germany or Switzerland, but it still played a role in enforcing patriarchal control. Women who spoke too freely, prayed too strangely, or lived too boldly were suspect. And in the colonies, indigenous women were frequently accused of maintaining pagan practices under the veil of Christian ritual. 6. Legacy and decline. As the centuries turned, the Inquisition became a paradox. It was both feared and bureaucratic, both omnipresent and deeply inefficient. The Enlightenment began to creep across Europe, bringing with it new ideas, liberty, reason, secular governance. Spain, for a time, resisted. But even monarchs began to question the usefulness of the tribunal. As Spain declined as an imperial power in the 18th century, so too did its appetite for Inquisition. The final official execution by the Spanish Inquisition took place in 1826, a schoolteacher named Cayetano Ripoll, accused of deism. He was hanged, not burned. Even that had changed. By 1834, Queen Isabella II issued a royal decree abolishing the Spanish Inquisition entirely. 3.5 centuries after it had begun, the fires were finally extinguished. History does not always die with its institutions. Sometimes, it lingers, in laws, in stories, in silence. The Spanish Inquisition may be over, but its shadow never truly left. When Queen Isabella II officially ended the Spanish Inquisition in 1834, the last prison doors creaked open. The records were boxed. The fires, long since cooled. Spain, like the rest of Europe, was being pulled toward modernity, toward constitutions, commerce, science, and secularism. But ending the institution did not erase its imprint. The legacy of the Inquisition is not found only in its edicts or executions. It is in the habits it instilled, the silences it enforced, and the culture it carved across centuries. The psychological legacy, a nation that learned to whisper. Spain became a nation of internal watchers. The centuries of inquisitorial control created a society where suspicion was embedded into everyday life. Families were trained to police themselves. Children were taught to report parents. Friends learned not to speak of faith too freely. And even long after the Inquisition's demise, these patterns persisted. Fear leaves fingerprints. Generations of Spaniards internalized the lesson that deviation, whether religious, philosophical, or artistic, could be dangerous. Many historians refer to this as el miedo colectivo, the collective fear. A cultural memory of surveillance, punishment, and enforced conformity. This legacy is difficult to measure, but impossible to miss. It lingered in Spain's later history, including during the Franco dictatorship, when censorship, religious conformity, and authoritarianism once again dominated public life. 2. The cultural legacy, art, satire, and silence. Artists, writers, and thinkers throughout history have grappled with the Inquisition's shadow. In Spain itself, some dared to speak, subtly. The playwright Pedro Calderón de la Barca masked criticisms of religious rigidity inside allegory. Later, during the Enlightenment, figures like Benito Feijó and Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos pushed for reforms, hinting that perhaps the fires of the past had grown cold with shame. Beyond Spain, however, the Inquisition became a symbol of religious tyranny. In France and England, Protestant writers used it as propaganda, highlighting Catholic cruelty to strengthen their own national narratives. Voltaire famously denounced the Inquisition as the ultimate enemy of reason. In Italy, memories of Galileo's trial were forever associated with inquisitorial oppression. In modern times, satire has taken hold. Monty Python's "Nobody Expects the Spanish Inquisition" is a darkly comic echo of this once feared institution. The line works because the true horror of the Inquisition is now shrouded in distance and absurdity. And yet, that absurdity was once a reality. 3. The Jewish and Muslim legacy, expulsion, diaspora, and memory. For Spain's Jewish population, the Inquisition was a scar that never fully healed. After the 1492 expulsion, tens of thousands of Jews fled to Portugal, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and parts of Italy and the Balkans. These Sephardic Jews, named for the Hebrew word Sepharad, Spain, carried their language, Ladino, and culture with them into exile. But many also carried trauma. Their ancestors had faced forced baptism, secret prayer, betrayal, imprisonment, and death. For centuries, conversos and their descendants lived in fear of being unmasked. Even today, surnames associated with converso families, like Toledano, Espinosa, or Abulafia, carry a heavy history. Muslims, too, suffered deeply. Though they were initially spared by the Inquisition's early focus on Jews, the conquest of Granada in 1492 marked a turning point. Forced conversions began. The Moriscos, Muslims who converted to Christianity, were soon viewed with the same suspicion as conversos. By the early 1600s, they too were expelled. Over 300,000 people forced from the land their families had inhabited for centuries. It was a purification, not only of religion, but of identity. And the echoes of that cleansing reshaped Spanish culture, language, architecture, and laws. 4. The legal legacy, trials, records, and red tape. One of the most chilling ironies of the Inquisition is how meticulously it documented its work. Thousands of pages of trial records, confessions, edicts, and correspondences survive in archives across Spain and the Vatican. These documents are a dark treasure trove for historians, windows into the fears, beliefs, and cruelties of another time. They also reveal how the Inquisition functioned not just as a spiritual body, but as a highly developed legal machine. It followed procedures. It kept receipts. It had appeal processes, audits, and protocols. This systematization of persecution inspired fear not only through brutality, but through bureaucracy. Modern authoritarian regimes have drawn from similar models. Fear masked as order. Violence cloaked in legality. Lessons and reflections, then and now. The Spanish Inquisition is often misremembered as a relic of the distant past, a medieval oddity, a Dark Age curiosity. But its lessons are timeless. It reminds us of what happens when religious absolutism is fused with political power. When conformity becomes more valuable than truth. When fear becomes a form of governance. It teaches us how fragile intellectual freedom can be. How easy it is to convince a nation that dissent is betrayal. That difference is dangerous. And perhaps most hauntingly, it shows us how injustice can be made ritual. How ordinary people, priests, scribes, town criers, can become agents of cruelty, simply by following process. 6. Spain today, reconciling with the past. In recent years, Spain has begun to reckon more openly with its inquisitorial history. In 2015, the Spanish government passed a law granting citizenship to descendants of Sephardic Jews expelled during the Inquisition. It was a symbolic gesture, a recognition of wrongs done, centuries too late. Historical education about the Inquisition has grown in Spain's schools. Museums and archives now offer access to inquisitorial records, not to glorify, but to remember. The legacy of the Spanish Inquisition cannot be undone. Now, let's take a look into why conversos, Jews who had supposedly converted to Christianity, were one of the main targets of the Inquisition. Imagine being told your salvation depends on conformity. That your identity must be shed, erased, and replaced. Now imagine that even when you change your name, your rituals, your prayers, it's still not enough. That's what it meant to be a converso in Spain. When we speak of the Spanish Inquisition, we often think of burning stakes and heretical books. But the Inquisition had a focus. A face. And for much of its existence, that face was the converso, a Jew who had converted to Christianity, either by persuasion, threat, or force. But why? Why were conversos, those who had accepted the church, seen as more dangerous than practicing Jews? Why were they the ones most aggressively pursued? To understand this, we must step into their shoes, and into the world that feared them. A history of coexistence and rising tensions. For centuries, Jews lived throughout Iberia, often peacefully, sometimes prosperously, especially under Muslim rule during the early medieval period. They were doctors, scholars, translators, merchants, essential threads in the fabric of Spain's intellectual and commercial life. But with the Christian Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Iberia from Muslim control, came rising Christian power. And with that power came a slow change in attitude, from tolerance to suspicion. By the late 14th century, anti-Jewish sentiment was boiling. Pogroms erupted. Synagogues were burned. In 1391 alone, thousands of Jews were murdered across Spanish cities. It was under this pressure, sword at their backs, fires in the streets, that many Jews converted. Not always sincerely. Not always voluntarily. Thus was born the Converso. 2. The Converso dilemma, between two worlds. To become a Converso was not just to change one's religion. It was to enter a twilight existence. You were no longer a Jew. But you were not fully accepted as a Christian either. You lived in a liminal space. You changed your name, dressed differently, avoided speaking Hebrew, restructured your household, and yet, you were still watched. The old Christians, those whose families had always been Catholic, called you New Christian. Not as a compliment, but as a warning. And the whispers began. She lights candles on Friday night. They don't eat pork. He buried his child without a priest. These observations, passed in gossip, became grounds for suspicion. The fear wasn't only that conversos had once been Jewish, it was that many were secretly still Jewish. And so, the converso became the ultimate threat, not openly defiant, but quietly different. 3. A crisis of purity, faith, blood, and power. In the late 15th century, as Spain neared unification under Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchy needed more than just territorial control. It needed spiritual unity. The crown envisioned una fe, one faith. Catholicism, pure and unchallenged. But how could you ensure spiritual purity if people were faking it? That's when the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, emerged. It wasn't enough to be a Christian. You had to come from generations of Christians. If your grandparents had been Jews, you were tainted. This was one of the first large-scale racialized religious ideologies in European history. And it was directed squarely at conversos. Even those who had risen to high social positions, judges, merchants, even clergy, suddenly found their lineage under scrutiny. Were your ancestors burned by the Inquisition? Did you have Jewish blood? Your faith no longer protected you. Your family tree became your trial. 4. The role of envy and resentment. But ideology wasn't the only force behind the targeting of conversos. There was something more earthly, envy. Many conversos were successful. They occupied high-ranking positions in business, government, and academia. Some of Spain's most brilliant minds, lawyers, poets, physicians, were new Christians. Old Christian families, nobles with more pride than wealth, resented them. And so accusations of heresy became weapons. The Inquisition became a tool not just of piety, but of rivalry. If you couldn't beat a converso in court or business, you might beat him with suspicion. Why they were feared most. Here's the core of it. Conversos represented something that terrified the Spanish state, the idea that belief might be a mask. Unlike Jews, who were openly other, conversos walked the line. They sat in church, sang the hymns, took the sacraments. But what if, behind closed doors, they still observed the Sabbath? Still whispered Shema Yisrael in the dark? The Inquisition wasn't built to confront outsiders. It was built to root out enemies within. And conversos, especially those who straddled success and secrecy, were the perfect target. 6. A personal reflection. Imagine you are born into a converso family in 1500. You are raised Christian. You attend Massachusetts. You pray to the Virgin. But your grandmother, in secret, still refuses to eat meat on Friday nights. She mumbles prayers you don't understand in a language you've never learned. And one day, someone notices. A neighbor. A rival. You come home and find a sealed parchment nailed to your door. You've been summoned. The Inquisition wants to speak with you. And suddenly, your baptism isn't enough. Your education means nothing. You're not just a person anymore. You're a question mark. A case file. A confession waiting to be extracted. This was the weight conversos carried, not only the burden of conversion, but the endless suspicion that no conversion was ever good enough. 7. The tragedy of belonging nowhere. The ultimate cruelty of the Inquisition's targeting of conversos was this: it created a class of people who belonged nowhere. To Jews, they were traitors. To Christians, they were impostors. To the state, they were convenient scapegoats. To themselves, they were ghosts in their own homes. This is why the Inquisition hunted conversos so relentlessly. Because they represented ambiguity in a system that demanded clarity. They were the gray in a world that wanted only black and white. And so, the fire burned hottest for those who had tried hardest to fit in. Let's shift into some more interesting and fun facts regarding the Spanish Inquisition and its practices. Without further ado, let's begin. 1. The Spanish Inquisition was actually late to the party. The idea of an Inquisition wasn't born in Spain. The first Inquisitions began in the 12th century in France, focused on Catholic heretics. Spain's infamous version didn't begin until 1478, hundreds of years later. 2. It was founded by royalty, not the Pope. Unlike earlier Inquisitions, the Spanish version was unique because it was established by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, not the Vatican. It was a state-run institution from the beginning. 3. The first Grand Inquisitor was a fanatic Dominican. Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, was a Dominican friar obsessed with rooting out false Christians. Under his watch, thousands were tortured and many executed, earning him eternal infamy. 4. It targeted converts, not just non-Christians. One of the primary groups targeted were conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity. The church feared they were secretly practicing their old religions in private. 5. Converts were accused of ridiculous crimes. Conversos were accused of things like cooking chickpeas the wrong way, not eating pork, changing their linens on Friday, or washing before prayer, all seen as signs of secret Jewish practice. 6. It was highly bureaucratic. The Inquisition was meticulously documented. It kept detailed trial records, inventories of confiscated goods, and witness testimonies. Some archives contain millions of pages that historians still study today. 7. The Inquisition had its own police force. Inquisitors were supported by familiars, a kind of religious secret police, laypeople authorized to spy, arrest, and enforce inquisitorial orders. Anyone could be a familiar, even your neighbor. 8. Accusers were kept anonymous. Those accused never got to confront their accusers. The identity of witnesses was kept secret, which made it nearly impossible for defendants to defend themselves. 9. Confession could save your life, or doom you. If you confessed early and sincerely, you might be spared execution and instead forced to do public penance. But if the Inquisition believed you were hiding something, torture and execution still awaited. 10. It employed torture, but legally. The Inquisition legally sanctioned torture, but with rules, only if the accused hadn't confessed, and only if they weren't elderly, pregnant, or ill. These rules were routinely bent or ignored. 11. It invented a ritual called the auto de fe. The auto de fe, act of faith, was a public sentencing ceremony, sometimes followed by execution. It was part religious ritual, part spectacle. Thousands would attend, and condemned heretics were paraded before crowds. 12. It wasn't just about religion, it was also about money. The property of the accused was often confiscated, and inquisitors profited. Some historians argue that greed was just as much a motive as faith. 13. The Inquisition had a bestseller list. They compiled the Index of Forbidden Books, a list of publications banned for heresy or immorality. This included works by Galileo, Erasmus, and even novels that challenged the moral order. 14. It had a big problem with mystics. Even Catholic mystics like Teresa of Avila came under suspicion. Her deep personal spiritual visions were dangerously close to individual revelation, which the Inquisition considered heretical. 15. It was also an early censorship machine. The Inquisition censored plays, paintings, and sermons. Artists had to be very careful. Even Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes was crafted carefully to avoid crossing inquisitorial lines. 16. Inquisitors kept score. The Inquisition categorized punishments like a report card. Reconciliation, imprisonment, public penance, or relaxation to the secular arm, which meant execution, usually by burning. 17. It reached the New World. The Inquisition wasn't limited to Spain, it followed the empire. Tribunals were set up in Mexico, Peru, Cartagena, and elsewhere, targeting conversos, indigenous converts, and anyone accused of syncretism. 18. Not everyone was burned. Of the roughly 150,000 cases tried over 350 years, about 3,000 to 5,000 people were executed. That's still horrifying, but the popular image of constant mass burnings isn't accurate. 19. People could be tried posthumously. Yes, really. If someone died before their trial concluded, the Inquisition could try their corpse, dig it up, and burn it in effigy. It was about symbolic purification as much as real punishment. 20. Even Catholic clergy were not safe. Priests, monks, bishops, and even cardinals were sometimes investigated if they expressed unusual views, challenged church authority, or showed too much interest in mysticism or science. 21. The Inquisition could ban ideas before they were even written. The Inquisition didn't just censor existing books, it issued pre-approvals for manuscripts, and authors had to submit works before publication. Some texts were blocked in manuscript form and never reached the press. 22. It sometimes forgave. If you informed on others. One of the easiest ways to receive leniency from the Inquisition. Name names. Informants were rewarded, and many people confessed sins they hadn't committed just to avoid torture, then implicated others to reduce their own sentence. 23. It spied on dead languages. Books written in Hebrew, Arabic, or even Greek and Latin were viewed with suspicion. Any language outside Church Latin and Castilian Spanish was potentially heretical, especially if it couldn't be easily read by inquisitors. 24. Some accusations were as petty as they were deadly. People were accused of heresy for things like not kneeling quickly enough during Mass, having Jewish-looking food in the kitchen, or even speaking kindly about Protestant reformers. 25. Female victims were often accused of witchcraft, superstition, or Moorish practices. Though the Inquisition wasn't primarily focused on witchcraft, like Northern Europe, women were disproportionately accused of using folk healing, casting spells, or participating in old pre-Christian or Muslim traditions. 26. Indigenous rituals in the Americas were labeled heresy. In colonial Latin America, native religious practices were considered demonic, even after conversion. Celebrating ancestral holidays, using native music or language in church, or mixing Catholic saints with indigenous gods could lead to trial. 27. There was a manual for inquisitors. A popular inquisitorial guidebook titled Directorium Inquisitorum, first written in the 14th century, was adapted and widely circulated. It gave detailed instructions on how to interrogate suspects and detect lies. 28. You could be punished for thinking the wrong thing. Belief itself, not just action, was punishable. Even mental heresy was a crime. Inquisitors were trained to extract internal belief through questioning and torture. 29. It was used to settle political scores. The Inquisition was often weaponized by nobles, bishops, and rivals to eliminate enemies, discredit competitors, or weaken powerful families. Heresy was sometimes just a convenient excuse for political maneuvering. 30. It targeted Protestants, but Spain had very few. Spain's Protestant population was tiny, yet the Inquisition spent massive energy pursuing them. This wasn't because they were common, but because Protestantism symbolized rebellion against Catholic authority. 31. It helped create the modern police state. The Spanish Inquisition was a precursor to modern secret police and surveillance states. It built files on individuals, created networks of informants, and collected vast data for political control. 32. Some executions were staged as spectacle. Burnings were sometimes scheduled during festivals or feast days, drawing huge crowds. The spectacle was meant to scare people straight, and reinforce church power through public fear. 33. It created a culture of paranoia. People lived in fear of saying the wrong thing, reading the wrong book, or even praying incorrectly. It created an environment where self-censorship became second nature. 34. Limpieza de sangre was used for discrimination for centuries. The concept of purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, continued to affect Converso descendants for hundreds of years. Even into the 1700s, universities and government jobs required proof that you had old Christian blood. 35. Some families had to prove their bloodlines with documents. To avoid suspicion or discrimination, wealthy families sometimes created elaborate genealogical charts and legal defenses, going back generations to prove they had no Jewish or Muslim ancestry. 36. The Inquisition inspired laws in other countries. Other European nations looked at Spain's Inquisition with both fear and admiration. Portugal created its own version in 1536, and Italy's Roman Inquisition borrowed many Spanish methods. 37. It was still active in the 19th century. The Inquisition was not a medieval relic, it operated into the modern era. Its final execution was in 1826, and it wasn't officially abolished until 1834, more than 40 years after Napoleon. 38. It banned some of the most famous books in history. Works by Galileo Galilei, Niccolò Machiavelli, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Descartes, and even Cervantes were at one point on the index of forbidden books. 39. It impacted the development of science in Spain. The Inquisition's censorship and suspicion of innovation meant Spain lagged behind much of Europe during the scientific revolution. Scientists feared persecution for exploring heretical theories. 40. Its archives are now open to the public. In modern Spain, many Inquisition records are preserved in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid. Historians have gained incredible insight into the daily lives, fears, and practices of people centuries ago. 41. Some accused heretics were just too clean. In certain cases, people were suspected of secret Jewish or Muslim behavior simply because they bathed more than usual. In a time when hygiene was rare, frequent bathing raised questions. 42. The Inquisition tried dead people, sometimes centuries after their death. Yes, posthumous trials were real. In one case, the remains of Cardinal Juan de Torquemada, uncle of Tomás de Torquemada, were dug up to investigate rumors of heresy, even though he had died over a century earlier. 43. False confessions were extremely common. Many people confessed to crimes they didn't commit simply to stop the torture, especially after being told they could save themselves by cooperating. These confessions were often the only evidence used in sentencing. 44. The Inquisition developed a psychological warfare tactic called Edicts of Grace. An Edict of Grace was a period of several weeks during which people could come forward voluntarily and confess their heresies, usually in exchange for a lesser punishment. It was also a way to gather intelligence on others. 45. Some heretics were actually executed for being too devout. Extreme devotion could appear suspicious. People who prayed obsessively, fasted too often, or claimed visions were sometimes accused of mystical heresy or even demonic possession. 46. Converts who were too Christian raised red flags. Ironically, conversos who embraced Christianity too enthusiastically, building chapels, donating to the church, even becoming priests, were seen as suspicious. The question was always, what are they hiding? 47. The Inquisition maintained blacklists for entire families. In many cases, entire family trees were monitored. If your ancestor had once been accused, even falsely, your future job prospects, marriages, and education could be affected for generations. 48. Artworks were censored, down to the facial expressions. Religious paintings had to pass strict moral guidelines. A saint shown with a too human expression, or a depiction of Christ showing pain that was too erotic, could be deemed dangerously emotional. 49. The Inquisition hunted priests who performed unauthorized miracles. If a priest was believed to have healed someone, spoken in tongues, or channeled a divine vision without official church sanction, they could be charged with heresy or sorcery. 50. Some tribunals imprisoned people for owning mirrors or amulets. Certain household objects, like mirrors, knotted cords, or inscribed stones, were seen as tools of superstition, witchcraft, or Islamic traditions, and could lead to an arrest. 51. Indigenous people were not always treated as heretics. While the Inquisition was brutal in the Americas, it considered most indigenous populations to be spiritually immature, not heretical, so they were often punished less severely than European settlers or African slaves. 52. Jesuits and the Inquisition were often at odds. The Jesuits, a Catholic order known for education and missions, were sometimes targeted by inquisitors for promoting humanist ideas, working too closely with conversos, or advocating for indigenous rights. 53. The Inquisition delayed the printing revolution in Spain. Because of rigid censorship and fear of forbidden knowledge, Spain fell behind other countries in printing, literacy, and scientific publications throughout the Renaissance. 54. Many records were written in code. Inquisitors often used abbreviations, symbols, and Latin shorthand to obscure sensitive details, especially in high-profile or politically risky cases. 55. Some torture devices were so feared they rarely had to be used. The mere presence of the rack, the strappado, or thumb screws was often enough to secure a confession. In some tribunals, they were used more for threat than application. 56. Victims were forced to pay for their own imprisonment. Those accused were billed for food, lodging, and the trial itself. If they couldn't pay, their possessions, or those of their family, were often confiscated. 57. Not all inquisitors were cruel, some were philosophers. A few inquisitors were skeptics, reformers, or legal theorists. Some pushed back against excessive torture or biased trials. But their voices were usually drowned out by more zealous colleagues. 58. Jewish identity survived the Inquisition through secret traditions. Families passed down covert rituals for centuries, like lighting candles in clay pots in cellars, or teaching Hebrew prayers as songs. These hidden practices became known as crypto-Judaism. 59. Many descendants of conversos didn't know their ancestry until centuries later. In the 20th and 21st centuries, DNA testing and archival research helped Spaniards and Latin Americans discover their Jewish roots, sometimes after centuries of silence. 60. The phrase, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," comes from a satire of its absurd power. Monty Python's iconic sketch satirizes the unpredictability and blind zeal of inquisitors. It endures because it reflects a dark truth: anyone could be accused, at any time, for anything. 61. The Inquisition's reputation was worse abroad than at home. While Spaniards lived under the Inquisition with a mixture of fear and normalization, outsiders saw it as monstrous. Protestant countries like England and the Netherlands used the Inquisition as anti-Catholic propaganda, depicting it as pure evil. 62. The Black Legend of Spain was fueled by the Inquisition. The Black Legend, La Leyenda Negra, was a term coined to describe the exaggerated, grim portrayal of Spain by its rivals. The Inquisition's brutality, whether inflated or not, was the central symbol of this reputation. 63. The Vatican didn't always approve of Spanish methods. Despite granting permission, the papacy frequently clashed with the Spanish crown over how far the Inquisition was allowed to go. Popes were concerned by its independence, and even tried to curb it at times. 64. Inquisition prisons were designed to break the mind. Cells were often windowless, isolated, and purposely left cold or overcrowded. Prisoners sometimes waited years before trial, often forgetting what they were accused of, or breaking psychologically before the first question was ever asked. 65. Many towns still have Inquisition palaces. In cities like Seville, Córdoba, and Toledo, the original Inquisition headquarters still stand. These buildings are often converted into archives, museums, or government offices, but the ghosts of their former purpose remain. 66. Some execution sites are now tourist spots. Locations once used for public burnings, especially plazas in major Spanish cities, are now lively town squares. Some have plaques. Many do not. Locals walk over stones once blackened by fire. 67. The Inquisition had a coat of arms. Yes, there was an official seal. It depicted a cross, a sword, and an olive branch, symbols of faith, justice, and mercy. The irony is chilling, given what it came to represent. 68. In some cases, mercy was granted. Surprisingly, there were rare cases where inquisitors showed restraint. A sincere confession, combined with public penance and payment of fines, could spare a person's life, even restore them to the community. 69. The Inquisition could pardon you after death. In certain cases, people who had been executed were later rehabilitated by later tribunals or church councils, essentially saying, whoops, they were innocent. This was obviously cold comfort to the victim's descendants. 70. The last known execution was in 1826. The final victim of the Spanish Inquisition was Cayetano Ripoll, a schoolteacher in Valencia. His crime? Deism, a belief in God without church dogma. He was hanged, not burned, signaling a shift toward modern punishment. 71. The Inquisition was finally abolished in 1834. After centuries of oppression, Queen Isabella II officially abolished the Spanish Inquisition, aligning with Enlightenment values and pressure from liberal reformers. It took nearly 356 years to extinguish it. 72. Some Inquisition archives were lost or destroyed. While many records survive, others were burned, hidden, or stolen, especially during times of war, revolution, and regime change. Historians still search for missing documents, particularly from smaller regional tribunals. 73. It left linguistic traces. Phrases like auto de fe, limpieza de sangre, and even terms like converso have entered modern vocabulary. Their use today in academic, religious, and pop cultural contexts, often stripped from their terrifying origins. 74. It made its way into modern literature. The Spanish Inquisition features in the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Victor Hugo, and Fyodor Dostoevsky. In Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, a man is tortured in a dark cell, clearly inspired by Inquisition methods. 75. It appears in operas, films, and video games. In Verdi's opera Don Carlos, the Inquisition is portrayed as a dark, violent force. In Assassin's Creed, it's a major plot element. Even Harry Potter makes subtle nods with its Inquisitorial Squad, a group that polices magical deviants. 76. Monty Python immortalized the Inquisition in comedy. The famous line, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," comes from a 1970 Monty Python sketch. It satirized the absurdity of total control and became one of the most quoted lines in British comedy history. 77. Some families still bear the stigma today. In Spain and Latin America, some families quietly know they descend from conversos. The legacy remains complex, mingled with pride, shame, secrecy, and rediscovery. 78. In 2015, Spain offered citizenship to descendants of expelled Jews. In a remarkable historical gesture, Spain passed a law granting citizenship to Sephardic Jews who could prove descent from those expelled in 1492, an attempt to reconcile with Inquisition-era persecution. 79. Portugal had its own Inquisition, and it was just as brutal. Portugal's Inquisition began in 1536 and lasted even longer than Spain's, ending in 1821. Like Spain, it targeted conversos, Protestants, and mystics. 80. The word Inquisition is now a metaphor. Today, Inquisition is used metaphorically to describe harsh questioning, ideological witch hunts, or unjust interrogations. The legacy of fear is embedded in language itself. 81. Some crypto-Jews pretended to be extra-Catholic. To avoid suspicion, many conversos and crypto-Jews overcompensated by becoming priests, friars, or generous donors to churches. Some even denounced others as heretics to protect themselves. 82. Inquisitors wrote poetry. A few inquisitors were scholars and writers who composed religious poetry, often about faith, sin, or divine justice. Some of their verses still exist today in Spanish archives. 83. There are entire villages with crypto-Jewish traditions still practiced today. In northern Mexico, New Mexico, and parts of Brazil, there are Catholic communities who, for generations, have lit candles on Friday night, avoided pork, or whispered Hebrew-sounding blessings, without knowing why. These are traces of secret traditions passed down since the Inquisition. 84. Crypto-Judaism was so common it has its own term. Historians use the term crypto-Judaism to refer to Jews who outwardly practiced Christianity while secretly maintaining Jewish rituals, often in absolute secrecy for centuries. 85. Some Inquisition victims became folk heroes. Figures like Luis de Carvajal the Younger in colonial Mexico became symbols of resistance. He wrote secret memoirs in prison, preserved today, which detail the internal conflict of a converso who clung to Judaism. 86. The Inquisition's files have been used for modern genealogy. The sheer volume of Inquisition documentation has made it a gold mine for genealogists, who trace ancestors through baptismal records, confessions, and even lists of witnesses and informants. 87. There were occasional mass accusations of entire communities. Some towns experienced mass denunciations, where dozens or even hundreds of people were accused at once, either for mass hysteria, local feuds, or one informant triggering a cascade. 88. Some inquisitors collected exotic objects. Inquisitors who worked in the Americas occasionally seized ritual items from indigenous peoples, including masks, feathers, and musical instruments. These were sometimes kept as curiosities in private collections. 89. Execution by burning was often symbolic. In some cases, the convicted heretic was strangled or hanged before being burned. The public burning served to make a theatrical, public statement, more than to inflict additional pain. 90. Some survivors wrote about their torture. Rare memoirs and trial transcripts include harrowing first-person accounts of water torture, sleep deprivation, and psychological torment. These voices, long suppressed, are now being translated and studied. 91. Inquisitorial techniques influenced colonial policing. Colonial authorities in Latin America borrowed inquisitorial methods to suppress revolts, control religious identity, and monitor racial boundaries. 92. Protestant countries turned the Inquisition into tabloid material. In England, France, and Germany, stories of Spanish Inquisition torture and execution were turned into popular broadsheets, pamphlets, and ballads, often exaggerated to provoke outrage and anti-Catholic sentiment. 93. There were heretical booksellers. People were sometimes caught smuggling forbidden books, from Protestant tracts to Enlightenment philosophy. Some were executed. Others became folk legends for resisting censorship. 94. Artists were commissioned to paint autos de fe. Several large paintings of public executions were commissioned to commemorate the power of the Inquisition. These artworks are grim, detailed, and often hang in museums today. 95. Some Spanish scientists fled to avoid Inquisition censorship. During the 17th and 18th centuries, some Spanish thinkers, especially those interested in astronomy or anatomy, relocated to France or the Netherlands to pursue ideas that would have been considered heretical in Spain. 96. Some famous Spanish families quietly changed their names. To avoid persecution or erase Jewish ancestry, many noble and merchant families in Spain and Portugal altered or abbreviated their surnames, a practice that later complicated genealogical tracking. 97. Modern Spanish museums include rooms of memory. Institutions like the Museum of the Jewish People in Girona and the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid include solemn exhibits to honor Inquisition victims and preserve Jewish Spanish heritage. 98. Some Inquisition survivors became martyrs in other faiths. Individuals who escaped Spain and publicly returned to Judaism or Protestantism were hailed as martyrs abroad, especially by Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire and Protestant circles in Holland. 99. The Inquisition inspired modern fiction tropes. Torture dungeons, shadowy interrogators, and forced confessions, these horror and thriller tropes have roots in Inquisition imagery, now embedded in global storytelling. 100. The Inquisition still sparks public debate. In Spain and Latin America, the legacy of the Inquisition is still politically charged. Debates over memory, apology, reparations, and church influence continue in schools, media, and public policy. We will now explore 10 of the most infamous trials of the Spanish Inquisition. Let's begin. 1. Luis de Carvajal the Younger, Mexico, 1596. A converso and secret Jew in New Spain, Carvajal was arrested with his family for crypto-Judaism. He wrote a personal spiritual diary in prison, describing his inner conflict and faith. He was burned at the stake. 2. Archbishop Bartolomé Carranza, Spain, 1559. A high-ranking church official accused of heresy after publishing a catechism with Protestant leanings. He was imprisoned for 17 years and only released after intense Vatican intervention. 3. Galileo Galilei, Italy, 1633, Roman Inquisition. Though not part of the Spanish branch, the Galileo trial by the Roman Inquisition became symbolic of the Church's suppression of science. He was forced to recant his heliocentric views and placed under house arrest. 4. Maria Barbara Carrillo, Mexico, 1645. Accused of practicing Judaism in secret, Maria's case revealed widespread crypto-Jewish practices in Mexico. She was executed with others in a massive auto-da-fe in the Zócalo of Mexico City. 5. Fray Luis de Leon, Spain, 1572. This famous poet and theologian was jailed for translating parts of the Bible into Spanish. When he returned to lecture after 5 years, he famously began, "As I was saying yesterday." 6. Francisco Maldonado da Silva, Peru, 1639. A physician and philosopher of Jewish descent, he openly returned to Judaism and was burned alive in Lima. His trial spanned 12 years. 7. Eleno de Céspedes, Spain, 1588. A transman and former slave, Eleno was accused of witchcraft, heresy, and impersonation for dressing and living as a man. His trial reveals early challenges to gender norms under Inquisition scrutiny. 8. Dona Blanca Mendes, Portugal, 1591, Portuguese Inquisition. Accused of secretly observing Jewish fasts. Her trial included dozens of family members and ended in confiscations, imprisonment, and exile. 9. Maria de Bohorquez, Seville, 1559. A teenage girl executed for reading Protestant texts and rejecting Catholic doctrines. She became known as the Virgin of Seville. 10. Cayetano Ripoll, Spain, 1826. The final victim of the Spanish Inquisition. He was a deist and schoolteacher executed for denying Catholic sacraments. His trial marked the beginning of the end for the Inquisition. Let's now explore 10 unique punishments and penances of the Spanish Inquisition. 1. The San Benito. A garment, a yellow tunic with red crosses, that heretics had to wear publicly. Some were adorned with flames or demons, especially for those sentenced to death. 2. Reconciliation processions. Accused heretics sometimes had to walk barefoot, in chains, around town while chanting prayers and being pelted with insults or debris. 3. Candle holding. Some were sentenced to stand in mass for hours holding a burning candle, as a form of public shame. 4. Cross carrying. Victims were made to carry large wooden crosses through the city as symbolic penitence. 5. The auto da fe parade. Even if not executed, individuals had to walk in public autos da fe, confessing sins aloud or listening as sentences were read for others. 6. Confiscation of property. One of the most common punishments, not just fines, but complete seizure of land, wealth, and heirlooms, sometimes leaving families destitute. 7. Whipping in public. Public flogging was common, especially for minor heresies. Sometimes performed during church processions. 8. Lifetime imprisonment in monasteries. Some were confined not in prisons, but in monasteries for life, forced to live in religious silence. 9. The spiritual exercises. Some heretics were required to undergo long-term fasting, isolation, and study of scripture under monastic supervision. 10. Forced marriages. In some cases, especially for women, sentences included being married off to good Christians to complete the reform. Next up we will compare the differences between the Inquisition in Latin America versus Spain. 1. Geographic reach. Spain's Inquisition was centralized in major cities like Seville, Toledo, and Valencia. In Latin America, it had regional tribunals, notably in Mexico City, Lima, and Cartagena. 2. Target populations. In Spain, the focus was conversos and Protestants. In the Americas, it expanded to indigenous peoples, African slaves, settlers, and crypto-Jews. 3. Views on indigenous religion. In Spain, heresy was doctrinal. In the Americas, it often involved syncretism, where native rituals blended with Catholic practices. 4. Use of intermediaries. Local clergy often served as gatekeepers, forwarding cases to inquisitors. This gave rise to more regional variation in how zealously rules were applied. 5. Transportation of victims. Some prisoners were sent back to Spain for high-profile trials, especially if their case could damage colonial stability. 6. Language barrier. Indigenous language use, such as Nahuatl or Quechua, sometimes protected communities from deeper investigation due to lack of linguistic access by inquisitors. 7. Trial documentation. Colonial trials often had more vivid personal accounts, revealing unique cultural conflicts between native belief systems and Catholic doctrine. 8. Maritime scrutiny. Cartagena, Colombia, was a key tribunal for monitoring transatlantic movement, including books, ideas, and Jews fleeing Europe. 9. African influence. Afro-Caribbean and African-descended communities were accused of witchcraft or sorcery tied to Yoruba, Congo, or Vodun practices, reframed as demonic. 10. Lasting legacy. Crypto-Judaism and indigenous Christianity persisted longer in Latin America than in Spain, often hidden in family traditions. Who actually were the inquisitors? Let's take a look. 1. They were often educated lawyers. Many inquisitors held degrees in canon law or theology, and were experts in procedure, not just faith. 2. Not all were cruel. Some inquisitors tried to reduce torture or introduce reforms, but were shut down by more zealous colleagues. 3. They lived in comfort. Inquisitors were typically well-fed, well-paid, and politically connected. Their residences were often lavish. 4. Some were ambitious politicians. Several inquisitors later became bishops, ambassadors, or royal advisors, using the tribunal as a stepping stone. 5. They had their own confessors. Ironically, inquisitors themselves often sought personal absolution, confessing their doubts and guilt in private. 6. They were watched too. Inquisitors were held accountable by internal audits and counter-inquisitorial reviews, though rarely punished. 7. Some kept journals. A few inquisitors kept private diaries, revealing doubts, political frustrations, and their own fear of sin. 8. They were trained in interrogation techniques. Their training included psychological methods, including how to detect lies, recognize signs of deception, and escalate pressure. 9. They were sometimes local nobles. In smaller towns, inquisitors were drawn from the landed elite, leading to conflicts of interest and abuses of power. 10. Some fled or resigned. A small number abandoned the role, disturbed by what they witnessed. These men sometimes fled Spain or went silent in records. Lastly, what were some rituals of crypto-Jews? Let's find out. 1. Friday night candle lighting. Hidden Jewish families continued lighting candles at dusk on Friday, often in clay pots or behind shutters. 2. Avoidance of pork. Even centuries later, some families refused to eat pork, without knowing why, a remnant of kosher tradition. 3. Secret circumcision ceremonies. Some crypto-Jews continued circumcision, calling it a family tradition without referencing its origins. 4. Hebrew prayers disguised as songs. Jewish prayers like the Shema were passed down as rhyming lullabies or nonsense songs to hide their religious meaning. 5. Burial traditions. Some crypto-Jewish communities buried the dead quickly, without a priest, and with feet facing Jerusalem. 6. Covering mirrors after death. A Jewish mourning custom, covering mirrors after someone dies, was practiced in secret by converso families. 7. Fasting on Yom Kippur. Secretly. Without calling it by name, some families fasted one day a year, saying it was for repentance or tradition. 8. Dual calendars. Families sometimes maintained two calendars, one Christian for public use, one Jewish for private rituals. 9. Use of Hebrew letters in embroidery. Some descendants have found Hebrew letters or stars of David in family heirlooms, hidden in textiles and carvings. 10. Teaching children to stay silent. Perhaps the strongest survival tool. Children were taught never to speak of family customs, even to friends or spouses. I hope you enjoyed those facts involving the Spanish Inquisition and its effects. Finally, we will jump into what life was like for a Spanish soldier during the Spanish Inquisition. Let's close our eyes and imagine ourselves in Spain when King Ferdinand II called for the Inquisition. My name is Martín de Olmos, born in the year of our Lord 1485, in a stone cottage on the edge of Segovia. The year before my birth, the Inquisition had claimed its first soul. I came into a world trembling with fire, and baptized in its smoke. From the very beginning, my life was shaped by three powers: the crown, the church, and the sword. My father was a foot soldier, scarred from campaigns in Granada, and a devout man, too devout at times. My mother said he crossed himself more than he kissed her. But it was her lullabies I remember most, songs in a soft tongue she called Ladino. It wasn't until I was nearly a man that I realized those were Jewish songs. We didn't talk about it. Not even in whispers. Especially not after father was questioned by the local friar. He denied everything. He drank more after that. Childhood in shadows. We lived poor, but proud. I learned to clean a sword before I could read scripture. By 9, I could recite Ave Maria and skin a rabbit. I was taught to bow low before the parish priest, and never, ever ask why he never looked us in the eyes. Our neighbors were careful around us. Some were warm, others watched from behind curtains. My older cousin Samuel vanished one winter. They said he had gone to Madrid for work, but his mother never smiled again. I remember the day the Inquisition came to our town. Not in cloaks. Not in secret. They came in daylight, robes white, crosses high, banners snapping in the wind. We were gathered in the square, every family, every child. The bishop read a list of names. A list of souls suspected of Judaizing. Then came the sermons. Then the bonfire. I was 11. One of the accused was the town baker. I still remember the smell of his loaves, warm, sweet, better than anyone else's. I never knew what he believed. But I knew he cried when they took him. I saw Father watching from the shadows, clutching his rosary, mouth tight. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but I never did. The sword and the cross. By 16, I knew I had to leave. My path lay with the army. I joined a regiment bound for the south. Spain was rising. The Moors had been pushed out of Granada. There were rumors of new lands across the sea. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were building something vast, and I wanted to be a part of it. I swore an oath before the church to defend the faith, the crown, and the purity of Spain. But even as I donned my uniform and kissed the hilt of my officer's sword, I felt a deep unease. Not from fear of battle, but from what we were asked to believe. They taught us to see the world as two things, Catholic or threat. And I had learned early that sometimes, the threat wore your mother's voice. A soldier's life is a rhythm of orders and silences. You learn to move when told, to kill when necessary, and to keep your mouth shut the rest of the time. But the silence grows heavier when the war is not just over land, but over souls. I was 19 when I took my first life. It was in the hills outside Malaga, in a scattered skirmish with rebels, mujars, they were called. Muslims who had converted under pressure, like so many. But some fought back. They knew the promises of tolerance would not last. We were told they were heretics, traitors to the realm. He was my age. Maybe younger. He charged with a rusted blade and died with my sword in his gut. No glory. No prayer. Just blood and breath and the weight of guilt that never left me. Among the soldiers, brotherhood and boundaries. Among the men, I found strange comfort. We were a band of orphans, bastards, and second sons, fighting for bread, pride, or to forget. Some prayed obsessively. Others laughed too hard. But all feared one thing more than death, being denounced. The Inquisition had begun sending priests to accompany the troops, dressed not for battle, but for judgment. They listened. They wrote. A misplaced word, a complaint about a friar, even a bad joke about a saint, and you could be reported. At night, we would drink, sing, and mutter our secrets only to the fire. I remember once, one of the younger men, Mateo, made a jest about the Virgin and the price of sin. The next week, he was taken from camp. We never saw him again. I began to write in secret. Not letters, but thoughts. Memories of my mother's lullabies. Questions I couldn't ask aloud. I kept the parchment in my boot, wrapped in oilcloth, terrified it might be found. The colonies and the cross. By 1505, I volunteered for an expedition to the New World. The voyage was long and brutal. Men died of fever, of madness. When we arrived in Hispaniola, the sun felt foreign. The land, endless. But we were told we were here to bring the faith, to baptize the natives, civilize them, and cleanse the wilderness of heathen ways. But it wasn't cleansing. It was conquest. We burned villages that resisted. We cut down idols and erected crucifixes where temples had once stood. But the people, they didn't forget. Even when they bowed, I could see it in their eyes. They remembered who they were. And so did I. One evening, I met a Dominican friar who had begun to question the mission. Fray Antonio. He was gentle, tired, and burdened. He told me quietly that this wasn't salvation, it was sacrilege wrapped in scripture. That the Inquisition had no mercy for the native soul. He would later be silenced. A crisis of allegiance. The longer I served, the more I felt torn between two oaths. One was the oath I had sworn to the crown, to defend its rule, its purity, its church. The other was the unspoken oath to my mother, to remember. To ask questions. To resist the silence that had swallowed so many. At night I would sit alone, hand on the hilt of my sword, and ask myself, what does it mean to be a good man in an age that punishes mercy? I no longer had the answer. When I returned to Castile in 1511, I carried two things in my satchel, the blade that had earned me my rank, and a scroll of parchment I'd never dared to show. I thought I was returning home. I didn't yet know that home had burned while I was away. Spain was changed. It had always been a land of extremes, gold and poverty, saints and traitors, but now there was something brittle in the air. Something tight in people's throats. The crown was richer. The church, more powerful. The autos de fe were more frequent. Public burnings had become ritual, held in grand squares like theater. Families watched as neighbors confessed on scaffolds, robed in flames painted on cloth. The faithful cheered. Some wept. Most just stared. I didn't go to the first one I passed through. I couldn't. The letter I shouldn't have read. My old village was not far from Segovia. I rode slowly, savoring the familiar fields, the ancient olive trees, the river that once held my childhood reflection. But the house was gone. Burned. In its place stood only a stone well and scorched timbers. I found a woman I recognized, Maria, once our neighbor. Her face told me everything before she spoke. My mother had been denounced. 2 years prior. She had continued to observe strange customs. Candlelight on Friday nights. Quiet hymns. A certain prayer uttered in a language the priest did not recognize. She was taken. The trial was short. She confessed, perhaps to stop the pain, perhaps to protect what remained of her dignity. She was burned in Valladolid. I never wept in battle. I wept then. Among her things, preserved by Maria, was a letter, addressed to me. In it, she wrote, I know what they say we are. I know what they fear. But if a soul can be faithful in silence, I have lived faithfully. They may take my breath, but not my love. I pray you carry it far from here. I folded the letter, placed it next to the one I had hidden for years. My own parchment. The questions. The doubt. Now I knew the answers had always been inside me. The whisper and the knock. I tried to live quietly. I took a modest house. I joined no feast, no procession. But silence is suspicious. A man of rank, returned from glory, refusing the cathedral, avoiding confession. I was being watched. It began with a whisper, at the butcher's stall, near the tavern. Then a knock. Midnight. 3 figures. Robed. Silent. They took me without struggle. I did not resist. I was escorted to a stone chamber beneath the Dominican monastery in Avila. I was not told the charges. Only that I had friends among heretics. That I had possessed forbidden writings. That I had spoken doubts to men of cloth. I thought of Mateo. Of Fray Antonio. Of my mother. And I said nothing. For 2 days, I sat alone in the dark. On the 3rd, I was brought before the Inquisitor. They say the Inquisition tortures the body to save the soul. But in truth, it seeks to unmake you, not just your flesh, but your name, your memory, your voice. In the dark, it waits for you to break yourself. The chamber was bare. A single chair. A crucifix above the door. The Inquisitor's robes were as plain as his voice, measured, exact. He asked my name, my rank, my allegiance to the crown. I answered. Then came the real questions. Had I ever known a crypto-Jew? Had I ever read texts not approved by the Church? Had I ever doubted the divinity of Christ? Had I ever questioned the justice of the Holy Tribunal? I said no. Then they brought out the parchment. It was mine, the scroll I had hidden in my boot for years. The one I had written with trembling fingers, full of thoughts I had never spoken aloud. I do not know how they found it. I suspect Maria. I was told this document was a testament to heretical sympathy, a confession of internal rebellion. They read from it aloud, line by line, turning my questions into evidence. What does it mean to be a good man in an age that punishes mercy? I had written that after watching Fray Antonio dragged away in the Indies. Now it was being used against me. The breaking of the will. They did not beat me. That would come later, if necessary. First came the long silences. The hunger. The cold. A methodical stripping of pride. I was made to wear a coarse robe. I was denied sleep. I was called Martin the Doubter, Martin the Suspect, Martin the Corrupted. When I did speak, I asked for a priest. They brought one. He urged me to repent, to confess whatever they asked. God forgives, even what is untrue, he whispered. Your silence will be your death. But I had seen death. This was something else, this was spiritual dismemberment. On the seventh day, I was offered parchment and ink. Write your confession, they said. Admit your sympathy for heresy. We know what you are. Let your soul be cleansed. I held the pen. I stared at the parchment. And I remembered a song. A melody, soft and ancient, that my mother used to hum when she baked bread. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't Castilian. It was older. And as I hummed it silently, the stone walls softened. The candlelight flickered warmer. The fear cracked. I did not write their confession. I wrote a prayer. In Ladino. May the God of my mothers remember my name, though the world forgets it. I folded it and handed it to the guard. That night, they took me to a new chamber. The rack stood in the corner. The ropes were ready. Pain is a language. It speaks without words. It cuts through pride, through armor, through memory. And when it has said enough, it leaves you not broken, but hollowed. A shape remade by silence. I was strapped to the rack at dawn. No prayers. No verdict. Only an inquisitor, a notary, and 2 executioners with practiced hands. The ropes were tied to my wrists and ankles. At first, they turned the winch slowly, stretching, testing. My breath caught in my throat. I clenched my jaw so hard I chipped a tooth. Confess, the inquisitor said. I said nothing. The next turn felt like fire behind my knees. My shoulders screamed. My world narrowed to a single truth: pain had a taste, metal and ash. They kept going. I don't remember what I screamed, if I screamed. I remember the ceiling melting. I remember my mother's voice. I remember the smell of burnt parchment, though there was no fire. They let go before the sinews tore. They weren't trying to kill me. Not yet. A voice returned. That night, I was left alone. My body throbbed in rhythms older than language. I couldn't lift my arms. I could barely breathe without feeling knives behind my ribs. But I was alive. And somehow, in that ruin, I felt light. They had taken everything. My honor, my strength, my certainty. But in doing so, they had peeled away the last mask. There was nothing left to hide. For the first time in my life, I whispered my truth aloud. I am a soldier. I am a son. I am of Jewish blood, and I do not deny it. And I fear nothing anymore. The stone walls didn't answer. But I felt something move inside me. Not pride. Not defiance. Something simpler. Peace. The verdict. When I was brought before the tribunal again, I did not plead. I did not resist. I stood, or rather, was held upright, and listened as they read my sentence. I was to be reconciled through public penance. I would wear the San Benito, a tunic painted with flames, and walk barefoot through the plaza, bearing a candle. If I recanted publicly, my life would be spared. Burning, it seemed, would not be necessary. But I was marked. Branded. Watched. My military commission was revoked. My family name erased from the rolls. Still, I lived. And in living, I remembered. I once believed that strength lived in the sword, in the clash of steel and the march of boots. But in truth, strength is what remains when the world has taken everything from you, and you still speak your name aloud. I lived. But not as the man I had once been. I left Castile. Too many eyes knew my face. Too many tongues remembered the trial, the robe, the candle in my hand. They whispered, "Soldier turned heretic." One of them marked. Tainted blood. I found refuge in Aragon, in the hills above Zaragoza, in a town too small to matter. I told them I was a scribe, a pensioned man from the Indies. No one asked more. I kept to myself. I grew herbs. I wrote. My hands, still stiff from the rack, ached with each stroke of the quill, but they remembered. What they wrote was not bitterness. It was memory. I wrote of my mother's lullabies. Of the boy I had killed and never forgot. Of Fray Antonio, and the native girl in Hispaniola who crossed herself and whispered to her ancestors in the same breath. I wrote of fire, and rope, and silence. And I wrote of hope. The slow cracking of stone. As the years passed, so too did the fear. The world changed. The auto-da-fe grew rare. The Enlightenment reached Spain on dusty roads and in contraband books. People began to question, quietly at first, then with voices growing bolder. I read of a man in France who said God was not in the church, but in reason. I read of others who denied the tribunal altogether, and were not burned. The Inquisition, still dangerous, had begun to erode, not from rebellion, but from irrelevance. I lived to see it diminish. That was enough. The final entry. I never married. I never returned to my old name. But in time, I began to speak again. To a boy who brought my bread, I told stories. To a widow who kept bees, I hummed the old melodies. To the village priest, kind, bookish, uncertain, I confessed that I once believed truth was something to die for. Now I knew better. Truth is something to live with, to carry, to pass on in small ways. A song, a line on a page, a whispered prayer at dusk. When I felt death approaching, I penned my last letter. To those who find this, I was born a soldier of the crown. I died a soldier of memory. I lived in an age that feared questions. But still, I asked. And in asking, I was free. I signed it with my full name. Martín Ben Yitzhak de Olmos. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Background Historian. I post daily content for sleep. Would love if you would subscribe if you enjoyed the content. For future video ideas and what you would like me to cover, please leave a comment below. Have a fantastic evening and sleep tight.